There were many other races throughout the Commonwealth, but two of them garnered the lion's share of attention. The contest in the 1st Congressional District between incumbent Representative Richard Neal and Holyoke Mayor Alex Morse, and the race between current U.S. Senator Ed Markey and 4th District Congressman Joe Kennedy III. Both incumbents won, but were the results surprising? For perspective, executive producer Tony Dunn spoke with two reporters who covered the election, New England Public Media's Adam Frenier and Carrie Saldo of GBH News.
I think what happened yesterday, Tony, was the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, who has been here for so long representing the Western Massachusetts in the U.S. House, flexing his political muscles, quite frankly. You know, people around here are very loyal to Richard Neal. He's never had a challenger, whether it's been in a general election or a primary election, get within single digits of him. And that was the case again yesterday. He got his people out to vote. You know, that whole idea of Richie Neal bringing home the bacon, which we seem to hear a lot during the campaign, it really resonated with the voters. They're very comfortable with what they have here. And while some favor the progressive ideas of Alex Morse, you know, I think they favor Richard Neal a little bit more because he's comfortable and he's done a lot, you know, in terms of bringing back the money. The numbers show that. So I think that's what happened yesterday.
Carrie Saldo, welcome back to Connecting Point, now with GBH News. You were at Union Station last night. What was the mood like throughout the evening, and when did the Neal camp know that this was going to be their night?
We knew at around 9:30, Kate Norton, his press secretary, gave the call that their internal numbers showed that Neal had won the night and that he would be showing up to give his victory speech. And Adam, I'm sure you felt this too. I mean, his supporters, a small handful, were there in their masks, but you could have mistaken that there were 150 people there by the amount of yelling and screaming and clapping that was going on behind us. And he came in, he was energized. It was definitely a victory lap when he came into that room. And I don't think that you can downplay his setting choice. Union Station, Richard Neal likes to make the point that it is kind of the house that he built, right? He even said it in his speech last night. He launched his first campaign for city council in that building in 1977. And at that time, he pointed out that he was going to work to revitalize that space. Now, it took several campaigns and several different political positions and 40 years, but the man came through. And when I heard him say that, boy, I just thought, wow, he's just putting salt in that wound for Alex Morse, who campaigned on this idea that Neal was a guy who was able to bring in big money, but didn't do much with his power for the region. And Richard Neal just said, here's one of the many things. Here's the house that I built.
Would you agree with that, Adam?
I would 100% agree with that. He harkened back to his first campaign for Springfield City Council, saying he announced under the very same clock he was standing under last night, I should say. And, you know, you could tell he's still pretty annoyed with Alex Morse. He did not mention Alex Morse's name one bit during the whole 10-minute speech. And the only, you know, nod that he did give to Morse was thanking the voters of Holyoke, Massachusetts, Morse's hometown, for a victory. So he really threw one more sharp elbow in a campaign that was full of them.
Yeah, I thought that same thing. You know, he took Holyoke by about 400 votes. And whenever anyone gets beat in their hometown, it's just rough, right? And for Richard Neal to point that out, for much of the campaign, he spent the time pointing to his record. He was reluctant to really jab Morse directly or even point to some of the shortcomings that could obviously have been pointed to in Holyoke, whether it was unemployment rates pre-COVID being 3 times the state level, poverty, things like that. Neal shied away from that for much of the campaign. But then last night, he was just kind of all in, as you point out, Adam.
And why did Morse lose in his own hometown? Are there any specific reasons that either of you could point to signal why he would lose?
I think if you look at his election history, Tony, he's never won except for one occasion by a huge margin. I think the average vote total for him in a general election as Holyoke mayor is about 54 or 55%. So he's always really had to work to hold on to the corner office in Holyoke. So I think that's part of it. You know, there's been this long running idea of old Holyoke against new Holyoke, kind of, you know, more of a centrist opinion to more progressive ideas. And Morse has really had to fight throughout his political career, you know, just to get his progressive ideas out there, and they're not universally held in Holyoke, as we saw by the vote total last night.
And I think there was an interesting pivot in Morse's speech, which, it was a concession speech, I guess, technically, but he was very quick to just say, "Congratulations, Richard Neal," and moved on. And what he focused on in the bulk of his speech was what he had done in Holyoke, his record in Holyoke, the things, the changes, the ideas that have come up, and how proud he was of the work that they've done there and the change that's been made in that city. That was a very different tone than we heard from him throughout the rest of the campaign, where he hardly mentioned Holyoke, at least in the times that I heard and read. He hardly mentioned Holyoke. He really focused on the other areas of the district and where Richard Neal had failed to show up in those other areas of the district.
The big issue in the race, which happened late in the race, was a letter by the Massachusetts College Democrats at UMass that was leaked to the Daily Collegian, which accused Mayor Morse of using, quote, his position of power for romantic or sexual gain. In his concession, Morse indicated that it played a role in his